And welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and it is so good to be back with you after our little hiatus. We, Baruch Hashem, thank God, had a beautiful time in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, for my daughter's wedding, and it was a wonderful simcha, and thank you for all the wonderful warm wishes that I received from all of you, and we should only share together in simchas and in happy occasions. But now, tonight, we are going to continue with our studies of Jewish history. With the death of Shabtai Tzvi, which is what we discussed last time we met, we really entered the era of modern Jewish history. Now you might think, okay, great, we're crossing from the 17th century into the 18th century. This is modern Jewish history. I've been listening to this Landis guy for way too long, for 47 sessions now. I'm glad it's almost over. Well, don't get too excited yet, because it happens to be the period, the modern period will take us quite some time to get through. Now that could be for one of two reasons. Number one is because just the plethora of events that have happened over the past 300 plus years, and how significant they are, and time just seems to be moving so much faster now than it did in antiquity. Or another approach could be because it is modern history, there's a lot more written on it, we know a lot more about the events, we have a lot more detail, so the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. But be it as it may, you're still not done with me for a little while. We still have a lot of Jewish history to cover together. So, with the end of Shabtai Tzvi, when he passed away in 1676, as we mentioned last time, that in no way, shape, or form was the end of his movement. Unfortunately, the damage was done in so many ways, and it would take at least 100 years for the Jewish people to clean up the mess of Shabtai Tzvi. First of all, even posthumously, there were still people who believed in him. Now, again, by the 17th century, it's not so strange to believe in a dead Messiah. At this point, the Christians have been doing it for almost 1700 years. And unfortunately, since then, there's been other groups, other Jewish groups, that have belief in a person as Messiah posthumously after they pass away. Definitely not a Jewish idea, but unfortunately is often embraced by Jewish groups. And there was no shortage of Sabbateans after the death of Shabtai Tzvi, even after the death of Nathan Agaza. Nathan Agaza's father outlived him. His father's name was Joseph Ashkenazi, and after Nathan's death, he turns up in Morocco and continues to fan the flame, so to speak, and keep the movement going in many ways. So with the death of Shabtai Tzvi, the movement's still going to a certain extent, but what becomes more virulent within the Jewish world is the witch hunt that takes place after the death of Shabtai Tzvi. Now, similar to, as we've seen many times in Jewish history, probably the most recent example would be the McCarthy affair here in America with the Red Scare, where everyone and their mother was being accused of being a communist, and it was really a tremendous witch hunt at this point in the Jewish world, because there, as we said, there were so many people who believed in Shabtai Tzvi, and many amongst the aristocracy, and many amongst the rabbis who believed in Shabtai Tzvi, so that when he becomes a Muslim and then eventually dies, it's not like they just say, "Oh, we were wrong, move on." No, there's going to be people who want to, so to speak, punish those who are guilty of leading the Jewish people down this path. And so, in many ways, in many communities, witch hunts break out. People are accused of being Sabbateans, both in the lifetime of Shabtai Tzvi and also posthumous Sabbateans, and it affects the Jewish world in so many ways. The biggest impact on the Jewish world came really from one family. Now, this family, the first rabbi we'll meet was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, who is known to us as the Chacham Tzvi, wise man Tzvi, who was a rabbi in Amsterdam in the end of the 17th century, who lived at the same time as Shabtai Tzvi, who saw the whole debacle and really had to deal with the aftermath. And he was the type of now. There's, at this point, we're the complicated personalities and characters of Jewish history are, we've met many a times, and we'll meet people who are on one hand very, very great, and on the other hand, there's, we have our question marks, and they're also complicated personalities. And Tzvi Ashkenazi was no exception to this picture, because on one hand, he was a tremendous Talmudic scholar, a tremendous Kabbalistic scholar, and in many ways was a great leader and a great rabbi. On the other hand, he was what we would call a kanai. He was a zealot. So that when he felt that there was an atrocity being done or an infraction of the Torah or a disrespect to the Jewish people, he didn't just say, oh, no. He didn't just ignore it. He felt it was important to fight it head on, to challenge it head on, and he was therefore regularly getting into fights. And because of this, he had a very illustrious career where he was a rabbi in no less than 18 different places. Because when you have that approach and that attitude, it is often not easy to hold down a job. But be it as it may, we definitely, I don't want to sound like I'm being disparaging about the Chacham Tzvi, because he is regarded as one of the Gedolei Yisrael, as one of the great Torah scholars of Jewish history. But it's important to point out this piece of his personality, that he was definitely someone who was prone to get involved in machlokasim and fights l'shem shemayim, but as we always say, there's no fight like a fight that's l'shem shemayim, a fight for the sake of heaven. And in the aftermath of Shabtai Tzvi, he was one of the key people who was looking throughout the Jewish world for people who were Sabbateans. And when he passed away, his son took over and really kept the fight going in almost a more major way than his father did. Now his son's name was Rav Yaakov Emden, who's known to us as the Yavitz, which is an acronym for Yaakov ben Tzvi. Yaakov ben Tzvi, his father's Chacham Tzvi, so the Yavitz is how he's known to us. And he was in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was a real hotbed for the Shabtai Tzvi movement, so there were no shortage of people to go after. And the Yavitz is really a chip off the old block. Also tremendous scholar, tremendous Kabbalist, but again, a very complicated person in Jewish history, and in no way, shape, or form did he hide away from fights when he felt they needed to be fought. And we know of many major fights that he had, and we also have many of his great writings. In fact, one of the great commentaries on the Siddur, on the prayer book, is from the Yavitz. This is from Rav Yaakov Emden. And in fact, I quote it all the time because he has one of my favorite if you have a favorite line, favorite quote in there, where he asked the question of the greatest miracle ever to happen in Jewish history. And he says it was not the splitting of the sea, it was not Mount Sinai, it was not the 10 plagues, none of that. It was the fact that the Jews are still here observing the Torah. Now, he wrote that in this time period that we've been discussing, which was a terribly tumultuous time period. In the wake of the Chmielnicki massacre, Shabtai Tzvi, the Crusades, after all of this stuff, he says, after all that, there's still Jews here observing the Torah. That is the biggest miracle ever on the map of world history. And as I always like to point out, if he was saying that in the 17th century into the really the 18th century, and Kal v'chomer bein beno shel Kal v'chomer, all the more so into the 19th, 20th, and now the 21st century. So, like I always like to point out, as the Yaakov Shweki song so eloquently says, we are a miracle. The Jewish people are absolutely miraculous. If anyone questions the idea as to if miracles happen nowadays, all you have to do is take a look at the Jewish people and you see absolute miracles. And one of the first people to identify that fact was none other than Rav Yaakov Emden. Now, the communities that Rav Yaakov Emden and his father before him lived in was known as the Ahu communities, which was an acronym for Altoona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. Now we know that as just Hamburg. At this point, it's part of Denmark, and nowadays it's part of Germany. But nowadays it's just we call it Hamburg. But it was a major Jewish community known as the Ahu communities, and the Yavitz, being the type of person we described, felt that he should be amongst the rabbinic leadership in Amsterdam. But because he had the personality we described, he was never granted the positions that he thought he should be granted. So he was never made a rabbi in Amsterdam, never made the rabbi of Ahu, and that leads us into one of the first major fights that he had, which was with the rabbi Raful Hamburger, who was the Rav of the Ahu communities at this time period. And, the Yavitz felt that the position should be his. It was the position of Raful Hamburger, who was also a tremendous Torah scholar. And that led to, to really put the Yavitz on the map, to put Rav Yaakov Emden on the map as the zealot warrior that he would continue to be the rest of his life. The second major fight that we have recorded was with a rabbi by the name of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. For those of you who are here with us in Cleveland, and you probably get our emails, and you know that I have a Tuesday night class that our marketing department refers to as Kabbalah 101. It is a class in the writings of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, most specifically his book Derech Hashem. Now, who is Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto? Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto lived in the early 18th century, and he was what we would call an eccentric. By all ways, shapes, and forms, he was a nonconformist. He was a young Kabbalist. He died at the age of 39. So, people have this idea that, you have to be 40 before you can study Kabbalah. Not really true. You just have to reach an age of understanding, which the Mishnah Avos says happens at the age of 40. But you have people who are definitely able to get there before that. And Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, was one of those people. And in his young short life, he is a tremendous scholar, both of Talmudic scholar, Kabbalistic scholar. He's a very prolific writer, both on Kabbalistic subjects and on non-Jewish subjects. He writes poetry, prose, plays, tremendous writer. Now, he lived in Padua, Italy, and because, number one, he was an eccentric and a nonconformist, and number two, he was young and well steeped in Kabbalah, these were not attributes that boded very well for someone after the Shabtai Tzvi debacle, because, that's what Shabtai Tzvi was. He was also a young, eccentric Kabbalist, and so they looked at Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and he, so to speak, had all the traits of that were not considered reputable traits anymore at this time period. So the rabbis tried to do something about it, and they said he needed to stop teaching Kabbalah publicly, and he just couldn't hold back. He was as we call it, Mayim Misgaber, an overflowing wellspring of knowledge, and he just kept teaching, even though he was told not to. He was eventually driven from Padua. He went to France. He was eventually exiled from France, and he ends up in Amsterdam, where Rav Yaakov Emden was. And of course, therefore, Rav Yaakov Emden identifies him as a potential Sabbatean, as someone who's behaving in a way that people shouldn't be behaving anymore. And therefore, Rav Yaakov Emden, went into another fight with him. And eventually, the young Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto leaves Amsterdam, also eventually making his way to the land of Israel, where tragically, at the age of 39, he dies in a cholera epidemic, and he is actually buried in Tiberia, in Tiberias, right outside of the burial cave of the great Rebbe Akiva. Now, one of the reasons for that is because Rebbe Akiva was a tremendous Torah scholar, and he lived his life, so to speak, or his life as a Torah scholar began at the age of 40 and went on from that point to the end of his life. And the Kabbalistic concept is that many say that Moshe Chaim Luzzatto might have been a Gilgul, might have been a reincarnation of Rebbe Akiva, and made up for those first 40 years when Rebbe Akiva wasn't yet a Torah scholar. Okay, that's what people say, and possibly because of that is why he is actually buried right next to Rebbe Akiva. When I was in Israel, I had the privilege of going to Tiberia, going to Tiberias, and praying at the gravesite of both Rebbe Akiva and the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, because they're definitely two of the great illustrious Torah scholars of Jewish history that I've always found very, very impactful on my life. So Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto had a very tragic life, and his life was really, no one knew what to make of him, so to speak, because everywhere he went, he just got excommunicated. Now, posthumously, he's been completely vindicated, and especially when we're going to talk about in a couple sessions about the Musar movement. The Musar movement will make one of his works, known as the Mesilas Yesharim, or the Path of the Just, that'll become the Bible of the Musar movement. And all his other works also are considered completely holy Jewish works. As I mentioned, we have a weekly class in Derech Hashem. Those of you here in Cleveland, feel free to join us Tuesday night, 7:30 p.m. at Green Road Synagogue, product placement. And he has many other writings. Das Tfunos is one of his other deeply Kabbalistic writings, and we have about 30 different books from him. And a great scholar. And it's unfortunate that in his time period, his greatness was misunderstood. And part of that was due to the Ivets, but there were others too who were on that bandwagon. But like I said, history and time has definitely vindicated him, and he is very much considered one of the great rabbis of Jewish history, and really one of the the fathers of Kabbalistic thought. So when we talk about that process that began with the Arizal and the Maharal of taking these ideas of Jewish philosophy, of Kabbalah, and for lack of a better phrase, dumbing them down for the populace, well, that was in the 16th century. Now we're on to the 16th, 17th century. Now we're on to the 18th century, and we're going to meet many others doing that. And the big name of the 18th century, one of the big names, was Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, and his books are still widely used until this very day, and they are definitely considered wonderful entrees into Kabbalistic thought. And that was the second major fight that Rav Yaakov Emden had. Now, just parenthetically, there's something else that's interesting about the Luzzatto family. The Luzzatto family is a great Italian family. There are other rabbinic leaders who came from that family. One of the other famous leaders from the Luzzatto family was a nephew of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, known as Shmuel David Luzzatto. Shadal is what they call him. He was in the 19th century, born in 1800, so he died near 1865. Now, he was an interesting character because he was part of the Wissenschaft des Judaism, which is the idea of the science of Judaism, or the academic look at Jewish thought. But this is what is often associated with the Haskalah, with the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about next week a little bit more. But he himself was always a traditional Jew and believed in traditional Jewish ideas. He just believed in using that approach, but still stuck with the ideas of the divinity of the Torah, the authenticity of the prophetic writings. And many others will use the ideas of the Wissenschaft to do the opposite, to try and show that Torah is not divine. That was not what the nephew of the Ramchal did. But more specifically, why I'm mentioning him is because Rav Shmuel David Luzzatto had a descendant by the name of Fiorello had a nephew by the name of Fiorello LaGuardia, none other than the famous LaGuardia, for who the airport in New York is named after, who is the mayor of New York for a very long time. If you want more about his life and his Jewish roots, his connection to the Jewish people, you can see my article that I wrote about this topic at rabbilandis.com or on h.com, where it was originally published. And it's just interesting, I always say, to point out that Fiorello LaGuardia was a lateral descendant of the Ramchal. Is really one of the most famous rabbis, and unfortunately, within 300 years, he has a very famous non-Jewish descendant. Actually, Fiorello LaGuardia was actually Jewish. His mother was Jewish. It was on his mother's side, but he did not practice as a Jew. But he was a descendant of lateral descendant of the Ramchal, a direct descendant of the Shadal of Shmuel David Luzzatto. Okay. The third major fight, and the one that really wreaks havoc on the Jewish world, the third major fight between Rav Yaakov Emden and was with a rabbi by the name of Rav Yonason Eibeshitz. Now, Rav Yonason Eibeshitz was the Rav of the Ahu community after Rav Rafal Hamburger, and Rav Yonason Eibeshitz, again, also tremendous scholar, tremendous Kabbalistic scholar, and not to mention a very prolific writer. We have numerous of his writings. First of all, on Halacha, we have on the Shulchan Aruch, the Urim V'Tumim commentary, the Kreisi Uplesi commentary, the Sar Aleph commentary. We have many of his writings on Chumash, Yaris Devash, Targum Yonason, Medrash Yonason. Many books we have from him, and they're wonderful writings of Torah. But he was a Kabbalist, and therefore he was under that microscope, because everyone assumed that Kabbalists at this time were potential or possible Sabbateans. Now, Yonason Eibeshitz got himself into a little bit of trouble when basically two things happened. Number one is that within the Kabbalistic approach, something that's often used are, in Hebrew, what we call kamios. In English, we translate that as amulets. Now, amulets were basically things, Kabbalistic ideas would be written on them, and they would be put in the amulet and hung around your neck, and they were claimed to have certain spiritual powers. Sounds like a crazy idea, but it's actually long before the proliferation interpretation of Kabbalah, it was already mentioned in the Talmud. The Talmud in Shabbos and in other places, but the Talmud specifically in Shabbos talks about if somebody's allowed to wear a kamiyah on Shabbos, if you're allowed to wear a kamiyah where there's no eruv, if it's a kamiyah written by an expert, therefore we know it'll work, or if it's not written by an expert, whole discussion about these amulets. But they were very popular with the rise of Kabbalah, and one of the ways that Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz first gets into trouble is there is a claim that an amulet of his had basically a secret code in it that said that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and that was the claim that was made, that this amulet that was claimed to have been written by Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz had this secret code that said that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and therefore people start to become suspect that he is in fact a Sabbatean. Now, when he was pressed about it, he at first said it was a acrostic for a verse of the Torah. Then he said he wasn't even sure what it was. Then he said he wasn't even sure he wrote the amulet. So even to start with, it's questionable how definitive this was. If Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz actually wrote it, if what the meaning was, but be it as it may, in the witch hunt of the time, it was enough for a lot of people's blood to start boiling, and that combined with the writings, a lot of the Kabbalistic writings of Yonasan Eibeshitz were compared to the style of the Kabbalistic writings of other Sabbateans. So these were the two main pieces of evidence, if you will, that the opponents, most notably Rav Yaakov Enden, but the opponents of Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz had against him. Again, the amulets, and that his writings were similar to that of other Sabbateans. And that was enough for the war to break out. Now, the reason why this was the really the worst of them was because both Rav Yaakov Enden and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz had tremendous followings. So they as the, so to speak, war broke out between them, they both circled the wagons with their followings, and it became, like these battles often boil over. It wasn't as much a fight between Rav Yaakov Enden and Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz as it became a fight of their students, of their adherents, of their followers, and it affected wide swaths of the Jewish world. So much so that when we talk about many of the other great rabbis of the time, they were very much involved in this fight. In fact, I read one article that said that even though Rav Yaakov Enden is considered the main opponent over here, the one who really challenged Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, the one who really was pushing the whole thing was actually Rav Yaakov Yoshua Falk, known to us as the Pnei Yoshua, a very famous commentary on Tosfos, on the Talmud, and according to at least the opinion of this one writer, is he was really the one pushing the fight. Just Rav Yaakov Enden was more of a fighter, so I guess he's the one who became famous because of it. On the flip side, we had the Vilna Gaon, who at this point was very young. We'll talk more about him in future sessions, and the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, who came in to try to intercede to stop the fight. They believe that Yonasan Eibeshitz was not a Sabbatean, and they tried to therefore put the fight down. Unfortunately, the government got involved. Rav Yaakov Enden was kicked out of Hamburg, and it was just a mess. And it coming after, you have an event like this maybe in isolation, maybe it's not so bad. But coming after everything we've discussed over the past number of sessions, you can imagine what happens when you have this major league rabbinic fight going on after all the death and destruction and terrible events that the Jewish world had, and it just really wreaked havoc on the Jewish people. Now, scholars went on to debate for really up until modern times as to whether or not Yonasan Eibeshitz was a Sabbatean, was not a Sabbatean. In general, our approach is he was not a Sabbatean. His books are still in Jewish libraries. I have his books on my shelf. His commentaries are in the Shulchan Aruch. We look at him as one of the great scholars of the Jewish world. But on the flip side, we also look at Rav Yaakov Enden as one of the great scholars of the Jewish world. So who was right? So there's a great lecture by Shneur Lyman, the great historian Shneur Lyman, where he goes into some of the evidence, and you can see how it could go both ways. And not only that, but there were definitely a number of Sabbateans that were, admitted Sabbateans that were discovered in the yeshiva of Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz, and in fact, Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz's son came out as a Sabbatean after his father passed away. So, I don't know. I really don't know. But, far be it from us to judge this time period. As the mission of us says, Al tidon es chavercha ad shetigim komo. We shouldn't judge a person until we've walked a mile in his shoes, because then we're a mile away and we have his shoes. But we can't fully understand the challenges of this time. And suffice it to say, and we'll leave it as this, that in the way that we look at both men, we look at them as both tremendous scholars in the Jewish world. We still use their writings and quote them as the great men of Jewish history. But unfortunately, this fight between them did wreak havoc on the Jewish community, on the Jewish world. Now, just an interesting postscript on this story is that Rav Yonah Sniper actually died first, and he was buried in the cemetery in Hamburg. And then when Rav Yaakov Emden died about 10 years later, it was an Erev Shabbos, it was a Friday, so there was a rush to get him buried before Shabbos, and it was a rainy, stormy day. And when the mourners came to the cemetery, they saw that the grave diggers had mistakenly opened the grave right next to Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz. And because it was Erev Shabbos and it was raining, there wasn't time to, if they want to get him buried before Shabbos, which is a big deal in our religion, not leaving people unburied longer than necessary, they went ahead and that's where they buried Rav Yaakov Emden. So it's interesting that in the end, they were so to speak chavrusas in the graveyard, buried right next to each other, or right near each other, actually. So it is an interesting postscript on the whole situation. But this is really the I guess the last piece of the puzzle of understanding these almost 700 years of just torment of the Jewish people, just terrible things, one thing after another, one blow after another, both from within and without, from outside influences, anti-Semitism, from within the Jewish community. And at this point, we're going to see that there's just wide, large swaths of Jewish people who have had enough, and when given the opportunity, are going to burst out of the Jewish community as fast as they can. So it just so happens that all of this coincides, or the culmination of all this coincides with the Age of Enlightenment. Now, the Age of Enlightenment officially starts with the French Revolution, and on paper, we could say the Jews benefited greatly from the Age of Enlightenment, because what came hand in hand with the idea of equality, with liberalism, was that everyone's equal. That you can't have different classes of people. You can't have downtrodden people who didn't have civil liberties and civil rights. You couldn't have ghettos. You couldn't have all that anymore. That didn't fit with the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Liberalism. So sure enough, with the French Revolution and the late 1800s, actually specifically on the date of September 28th, 1791, the revolutionary France emancipated the Jews, and the 40,000 Jews of France were allowed to be full citizens of France. And the areas that Napoleon conquered, that idea of the emancipated Jew went with him. But it's not like this was like, okay, great, we don't have the pressures of the ghetto anymore, so now we can be committed Jews and committed Frenchmen at the same time. That ain't what happened, right? Once the Jews are able to burst out of the ghettos, we mentioned how terrible the life was in France in the 700 years leading up to this. Once they're allowed to be free men, they choose to be free Francs, right? Free Frenchmen, and mass assimilation comes hand in hand with emancipation of the Jewish people. Now, ironically, the next wave of emancipation after the French Empire is none other than what eventually becomes known to us as Germany. So it's just one of those ironic twists that when the lights will eventually be shut out on European Jewry in a major way, that'll happen at the hands of the Germans. And really, right here at the beginning of the process of emancipation, that also happens very much in Germany. Now, Germany is interesting because up until this point in history, it's made up of many different municipalities, many different princedoms, and they're always bickering with one another. And we know that was the right way for it to be, because once it becomes united under one kingdom, it throws the world into two major wars, almost destroying the world twice. But what's really fascinating is all of this was actually predicted by our Talmud. Remember, the Talmud sealed by the year 500. So 1,300 years before we're talking today, 1,500 years before Hitler, this is what the Talmud says in Megillah Daf Vav. It says that Amar Yaakov Livnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Yaakov says to Hashem, Ribbono Sh'olam al titain le'esav Rasha tavas libo. Don't give Esav what he wants. Don't give my evil brother Esav what he is looking for. And the Gemara goes on to say, well, what is it that Esav is looking for? It says he's looking for Germania Shel Edom, which translates as Germany of the empire of Edom, which is the empire of Esav. Because if they're able to go out and force, Macharivin kol ha'olam kulo, they will destroy the whole entire world. But it doesn't stop there. The Talmud goes on to say, Am Rabbi Chama bar Chananya, Talas mea ketire taga ika b'gemar mishal Edom. There are 300 princedoms within Germany. Usalas mea v'shitin v'chamsha Marzbadin Ika Barome, and there's 365 of them in the rest of the Roman Empire. Ubako Yome Nafki Hine Laape Hine Umito Chad Menayo, and they go out every day and they kill each other. Mitarte Leume Leukme Malka, and then after they are done. After they are done killing each other, then the next one is appointed as ruler. Basically, what this is saying, as the commentators understand this, is Germany, as the Talmud says, again, written down the year 500, or before the year 500, sealed by the year 500. But it says that there's this part of the Roman Empire known as Germany, and it's made up of all these little princedoms, and they're always fighting with each other. And woe unto us if they ever unite and stop fighting with each other, because then they will destroy the whole entire world. And that's exactly what we see happen at this point. So this prophetic idea is really plays out very much in this part in history, in this time period. First of all, what is Germany? What is this area known as leading up to this time period? It's called the Holy Roman Empire, right? And it's not Rome as in the boot over in Italy, right? It's Germany, but they're called the Holy Roman Empire. So they even refer to themselves as Edom, as Rome, and and that's just a prophetic idea that comes from the Talmud. But the beginning of the unification of Germany starts in the 18th and 19th century through the house of the Hohenzollern. That's the family that these princes come from. And the one who is the first one to have the name of the King of Prussia. Prussia was the largest city-state within Germany, and around Prussia, the whole of what eventually becomes known as the German Empire unites. And there's the king or the ruler of Prussia is a man at this time by the name of Frederick II or Frederick the Great, and he is the first one who makes strong steps to really unify Germany. But beyond that, he is also a champion of the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of liberalism. So coming along hand in hand with his uniting of Germany and his bringing these city-states all together in one empire is also comes hand in hand with that is the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of the Enlightenment, and the ideas of emancipation. And so therefore, within this empire that Frederick II, that Frederick the Great builds, he eventually we will see that the Jews are going to be emancipated, and they will have freedoms within Germany. But again, it's not like, okay, we're free now, we can live our lives as Jews. No, it's free, and they run away from Judaism almost as fast as they can. Now, one of the famous personalities in Germany was somebody who, in his time period, was not fully appreciated, understood. I think I once heard Rav Beryl Wein say he's almost like the inverse of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, because on one hand, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was misunderstood and treated terribly in his lifetime, and then is vindicated by history and posthumously with all his writings. The opposite of that is Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, because in his time period, he has much correspondence with many great rabbis, is known as a tremendous scholar. scholar, but we're going to see posthumously what comes from him is out of his 6 children, only 2 will actually be buried as Jews, 4 will convert to Christianity, and he will not even have a Jewish grandchild. And that speaks volumes about what he was about, but he is really considered the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, and as Jews are emancipated in Germany and Jews can go to university, he goes to university, he pushes this en masse, says every Jew should go to university, every Jew should become educated in secular studies, and embrace German culture, etc., etc. Now, nowadays in 2022, these don't sound like radical ideas, because it is totally possible, and we'll discuss the development of this, to go to university. Right now, one of the undersecretaries in the president's cabinet is a Beis Yaakov graduate, a very observant Jew. We've had observant Jews, heads of companies reach the highest of levels, and nowadays we figure out how to balance it. But at the time period when Mendelssohn was talking, there was no balance. Those who wanted it wanted only it, and didn't, so to speak, want Judaism. So while Mendelssohn himself remains an observant Jew his whole life. He writes in one place he was once late for a certain government meeting because he had to daven Mincha, and that he never missed davening Mincha in his entire life. So while he dies an observant Jew, his philosophies took so many in the Jewish community very far away from traditional Judaism. And like we said, we see the proof in the pudding with his own family that he does not even have a Jewish descendant. And but he is really coming into this, the emancipation of the Jew, in Germany, and is the father of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, which we'll call the Haskalah, and the father of the Reform movement. And we'll talk about the havoc that this will wreak on the Jewish people in the next few sessions. Now, what's interesting is the main mistake that Mendelssohn made was that he thought everyone could be a Mendelssohn, and this is a mistake that geniuses often make, especially when they start preaching philosophies for the masses. If you're a genius, you can have 15,000 degrees and be an expert in all topics and still never miss a mincha. But most people can't handle that balance, right? You can't be great in everything all the time. I remember when I was in yeshiva in Baltimore, Ner Yisrael, there was a new school starting in Maryland that they were calling Eshkol. Eshkol is an acronym we find in the Talmud, which means Ish Sheish Bo Kol, the man who has everything. And the idea of the school was they were going to be the best secular scholars, the best Torah scholars, had the best sports teams, had the best everything. And I remember before it even opened, this teacher of mine who happened to be of German descent said basically, you can't do it. You can't be the best in everything. You have exceptional people who can be great at everything, but many people have to kind of choose their path and embrace their path. And the idea of being great at everything is not a recipe for the masses. But that was one of the mistakes Mendelssohn made. So for him, he was able to do it all. But for many of his followers, or really all of his followers, it was embracing the ideas of secularism to the exclusion of the ideas of Judaism. Now, the last personality I want to mention tonight that definitely plays into this time period is none other than the Rothschild family. The Rothschild family is really one of our first successful Jewish business people, our first Gevirs, we would say, our first really wealthy Jew of modern times. And the family really invented modern banking, and that's a lot of how they had their success. They financed the Napoleonic Wars, really both sides. They made money on both ends of it, and just achieved a tremendous wealth. Now, the original Baron de Rothschild was an observant Jew his whole life, and many of his descendants were observant. But that success was famous within the Jewish world, and it led many Jews to believe, they could also be a Rothschild, and therefore that just added to the pressure of getting out of the ghetto, of trying to get out of the downtrodden lives that they had lived for so long, and what came hand in hand with that was often, or almost always, throwing away their Judaism. Now, the last one I want to say tonight is that with the Age of Enlightenment and secular liberalism, anti-Semitism pivots, because really from the time immemorial, for the past 1,700 years up until this point, anti-Semitism was a religious anti-Semitism. It was based on the Jews not being Christian, and if the Jews would become Christian, for the most part, they would be left alone. But the ideas of anti-Semitism are going to exist even in the secular secular world, just they're going to take the religion out of it. And that actually becomes much more dangerous, because when you take the religion out of anti-Semitism, at that point you can't change it. At that point it's they're looking not at our religion, but they're looking at our ethnicity, which we are an ethnic people. We are a people, but that's all they're looking at it. And therefore, when we're going to get to the people like Hitler, Yamach Shemo, there's going to be no running from Hitler. You're not going to be able to convert to become a Protestant or throw away your Judaism and be accepted by the Nazis. If you're born a Jew, if you're 1/4 Jewish, you're always Jewish. And that really comes hand in hand with the original anti-Semitism in the world, mixed together with secularism, so to speak, taking the God out of the anti-Semitism or the religion out of the anti-Semitism, and it'll pave the way for secular anti-Semitism, which will be a much more virulent and deadly anti-Semitism that, as we know, in the 20th century will kill at least 6 million Jews. And on that happy note, we'll wrap it up for tonight. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for listening. I look forward to continuing in the coming weeks as we discuss more of these turbulent times with the development of Reform Judaism, and on the other side, the development of the Hasidic movement and the Yeshiva movement and the Muslim movement, and how all of those movements were a result of all of these terrible events that we've been discussing in the past few sessions. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to being with you again next